name is Fiona Lambe. I'm a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. So we're a environment development think tank, I guess you could say, and we're global. So we have our headquarters here in Stockholm, but we also have regional centres in Bangkok, in Nairobi, Bogota, the UK, the US. We have about 8 centres around the world. Just a couple of words about me. I'm not a trained designer or service designer. So I'm a social scientist and my background is in development studies. But then I went and did a PhD in design and I just wound that up in the spring. So I was at Linköping University. And it's just super nice to have the opportunity to go into a bit more depth about my PhD. I've talked about it a little bit since the spring. Once I got over the trauma of going through the defense and everything, I managed to be able to talk about it, but it's usually in the form of a speed talk or a very quick sort of session. So it's nice to have a bit of extra time to delve into it. My research focused on using service design in so-called development settings. So in the global south, you could say, in places where there's a need for interventions to support with certain sectors and certain development-related problems. And that's what I'll be going into today. And I'd just like to say it's a really nice gift. Today's my birthday, so it's especially nice to have this gift of a bit of time to talk about this stuff. So thanks for that. So like any good academic, I guess I'll cover all of this background, aims, research questions, what kind of theories I was leaning on, a bit about the methods, of course, about the 3 case studies that form my PhD. I hope to spend a bit of time explaining them and what I found, what we found, why it was relevant and significant, and hopefully why it's relevant beyond the contexts where I was working, which was in East Africa. I'm hoping that to lift up some elements of my work that could be useful in this part of the world also. But also some storytelling. So I think it's really nice to be able to show where these ideas came from, why I ended up where I did, so to speak. And I think sometimes these stories are a little bit missing from academic presentations. You're kind of left sometimes with this idea that everything was very neat and went in a certain sequence. And it's often not the case. It's kind of messy and uncertain. So it's nice to be able to talk a bit about that as well. But to the background to all of this then, as I said, I'm coming from development studies, not from design. I was first a practitioner working on energy access projects before I became a researcher. I was mostly working in East Africa. And this work is interdisciplinary. So the rationale speaks to 2 different disciplines. It speaks both to the development studies side and also to the design side. So the starting point for my work is really this sad fact, the prevalence of poverty in the world. The fact that close to 10% of the people in the world are currently living below what we call the international poverty line, and that around 60% of those people are living in sub-Saharan Africa. And good to point out that poverty is now typically understood as being multidimensional. So this means that people suffer from many different deprivations all at the same time. It could be lack of education, inadequate living standards, disempowerment, the threat of violence, or living in environmentally hazardous places. And these things intersect to cause multidimensional poverty. And more than 1 billion people are living in that situation. And unfortunately, it's not getting better. It's deteriorating for different reasons. Climate change is a really big reason. A lot of the people who are living in multidimensional poverty are also living in precarious places when it comes to environment and climate change. Because of armed conflict, it's also worsening things. As we look at the world today, you can see many examples of that. And more recently, the impact of COVID has really rocked economies and household budgets all around the world, which has really sort of made these problems even more acute. And there's a sense of urgency. I think you really hear that now. We just had the COP meeting, the climate change meeting the other week. It feels like every week there's a global report coming out either about climate or development, talking about the urgent need to tackle these problems. And there have been efforts to do this over the years. We've had coordinated efforts to tackle poverty underway since, the end of the Second World War, more or less. These efforts are collectively referred to as development. I sometimes call them, or they're often referred to in the literature as big D development. So what the big global institutions are doing to tackle these problems. And we find today a whole plethora of actors involved in these, from the likes of UN agencies to NGOs, private sector, and so on, governments as well. And these conventional approaches have a tendency to be rather top-down in nature. They apply often quite a linear intervention logic, where a problem is defined, root causes are sort of identified, causal pathways to tackling the problems are identified, and then interventions are designed based on that. And contrary to what a lot of people think, that way of doing things has actually been relatively successful and useful. In particular, where development problems are sort of, so to speak, straightforward or easily defined, and where discrete technological or logistical solutions can be found. So examples would be eradicating smallpox in the 1980s, or the Green Revolution in India in the 1970s, arguably. But these models have been really less successful when things get more complex. So as we all know, humans operate in sort of interdependent, co-evolving, what I call, or my colleagues and I call, social-ecological systems. This means that behaviours at a local scale can influence things going on at higher scales in the system, so at subnational, national, regional, or even the global scale. And then those things can in turn impact behaviours and local processes back at smaller scales. And linear models to dealing with problems in these types of systems are just insufficient. You can never predict what the impact of an intervention is going to be. So what we need perhaps instead are approaches that are more based on experimentation, more iterative learning that can more easily cope with uncertainty and unpredictability. Also good to mention or go into in a bit more detail is this idea of multidimensional poverty. So linear models have sort of struggled to incorporate the perspectives and the needs of people who are supposed to benefit from development interventions. So experiences of poverty and the extent to which somebody is going to benefit from a development intervention can really vary depending on very individual and personal circumstances and characteristics. For example, gender, age, ethnicity, and location, and so on. So designing interventions to improve well-being really requires a deep understanding of situated individual experiences, needs, and preferences to understand what do people consider valuable for living a good life. So where did design or service design come into this for me? Well, a key assumption of my work in the thesis is that service design can address this complexity and can enhance local participation in the design of interventions. And I think I arrived at that assumption myself personally through the work that I had done both at SCI and previously as a practitioner, through trying out service design methods in my work. This photo here is taken from a project around 10 years ago now in northern India. And it wasn't set up to be a service design project at all, or even, I don't think I even had the word design in my head, but I was trying to find better ways of understanding what was happening in people's homes. This project was about cooking and household energy. So really using ways to try to, non-verbal ways to help people explain what was happening for them. So just building up this feeling over time that these methods were giving me a lot more than the more conventional research methods were giving me. And then, of course, looking into the literature as a deliberately sort of iterative and emergent approach, design or service design requires continuous engagement and empathizing with stakeholders and really putting them in the center of these processes. So it seemed to me really well placed to make a difference in these complex development challenges. So here's to the research questions then. I can just pop them all up. I had 3 core research questions in my thesis. So I hope these make sense given what I've said so far, the background and the rationale. The overarching aim was to explore how can service design be used as an approach for designing development interventions in complex social ecological contexts. So pretty broad aim. And then to untangle that, I have these 3 questions. The first one, what are the features of service design that can be used for capturing and making sense of local contextual information for use by other important actors in the system? And there I had in mind program designers or policymakers primarily, but it could be governments as well, or subnational level policymakers. And the aim with that question was to try to look at how service design could be used to understand situated local experiences of individuals or households, the so-called target beneficiaries of these things, and then communicate that package and communicate it for other actors who could do something about these problems. The second research question then, what are the distinguishing features of service design that can enable local agency in intervention design? So here I was looking to contribute some empirical evidence around how service design tools could create or facilitate the conditions for local, that's individual, household, community agency in the design of these things. And then the third research question might seem like a bit of an odd one, but maybe it makes sense given my background from development studies, which is a bit more, I suppose, quantitative. The gold standard in development studies is often randomized controlled trials or highly quantitative research. This tends to be the sort of data that policymakers are looking for to inform their plans and so on. So the aim of this research question was to explore potential complementarity between more conventional development research methods used in development studies and service design methods, and sort of acknowledging that there's an appetite for that type of data with policymakers, that often qualitative work on its own isn't enough for them to base their policies on or their plans. So this idea of adding some robustness, finding ways to triangulate things that come out of service design projects was interesting for me. A little bit about the theoretical and conceptual framing then. So the first part, and really the red thread, I would say, throughout the whole thesis was service design as an approach and a practice. So I know that many people on this call are very aware and familiar with all of this, but really looking at the sort of defining features of the practice of service design as being both a set of tools and techniques that can be useful for service innovation, that have been proven to be very useful in the public sector for addressing so-called wicked problems in these complex settings. And then the defining features, the human-centeredness, co-creation. I was a big fan, obviously, of Stickdorn and Schneider. That was my Bible when I was first learning about service design, but I think it really still makes a lot of sense. It really made it clear that the practice of service design was well suited to the challenges of complexity in these settings where I was working. And then tools for visualizing, the practice of making sort of external representations to communicate stakeholders' insights, and whether this could be used, as I was saying in my slide on research questions, whether it could be used to help package very complex contextual information for people working at other parts of the system, other levels of the system. And then I think value in use, although not necessarily, often talked about when we think about the practice of service design, I think value in use became so important in my work. This idea that services and interventions don't have any intrinsic value just on their own. They become valuable when they are used by people, when people start to engage with them and use them, that's when they become valuable. That's when people evaluate them. So this idea, I think, for me, was crucially important for development contexts where there's a tendency for the beneficiary or the person on the receiving end of the intervention to be viewed as somewhat passive, sort of on the receiving end of something that someone else designs. And I really thought the idea of value and use was quite empowering, that it reframes the beneficiary as a really important co-designer or component of the service. And then later in my work, I became really interested in the literature on service design for transformation, the work of Sangiorgi and Hilary Cottam as well, transformative services and what do they look like. So a starting point was this conceptual framework that colleagues and I came up with. And this actually came about just as I was getting started with the PhD. So this conceptual framework was developed using case studies that happened just prior to my PhD. And at that time, so we're talking sort of 2016, 2017, there was a huge amount of interest in behavioral economics, especially in nudge theory. We had 2 Nobel prizes, I think, in behavioral economics related to nudge. We had Richard Taylor and then Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee in 2019. So a huge interest in nudges and how can we use behavioral science and nudges to design interventions for development or developing contexts. And this idea that if only we can identify the key behavioral driver or the main cognitive biases that are holding things back, then we can design the perfect intervention. So really trying to look for a silver bullet in all of this. But the sorts of contexts, like I said, we're working in, they don't lend themselves well to applying nudges, because to apply a nudge, you need to isolate a behavior, one thing that you want to change with the intervention. For example, if you're looking to introduce improved cookstoves into people's homes, there are many behaviors that need to be taken into consideration. There are many different people involved in cooking and gathering fuel. Also, these behaviors aren't static. They shift and change over time. Not to mention the complexity of tradition and culture that's related to food and cooking. So it's impossible to identify the one important thing upon which the success of an intervention kind of hinges. So what we realized back then was the silver bullet was methods or approaches to make sense of the complexity, to be able to map out these behaviors, to identify patterns in the behavioral drivers. What happens with whom and when in the journey of an intervention? So this framework we developed here, like I said, it was developed using case studies prior to my research. Really, it focused on understanding and situating individual behaviors in relation to the wider system. But it was highly conceptual. It was based on empirical work, but hadn't really been tested. So that was the first thing that I wanted to do. But zooming out, just to give you an overview of the case studies that were part of my PhD, there were 3 of them. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on this because I will talk about each one in turn. They're not in order here, which is unfortunate. The first one was Kenya, clean cook stoves. So it's the second one listed here. There we looked at a clean cook stove intervention in peri-urban Nairobi. We followed 30 households who were embarking on the journey of trying out a new improved clean cook stove. We followed them over about 6 months, doing interviews and focus groups with them, and workshops. We had prototyping workshop with them, but also with other stakeholders in the system. The second case study was in Uganda. There we were looking at an insurance product. So we were there to support a partner of ours that was trying to design a new weather index insurance product to protect small farmers from the uncertainties of climate change in eastern Uganda. And there we did, it was a shorter study. We just had a few weeks there, but we had 48 interviews, a whole lot of focus groups. We had prototyping both in interviews, but in field workshops with people as well. I should say in the Uganda and the Kenya case, we combined the service design approach with quantitative methods. So we had our service design qualitative work, but then we tried to find ways to triangulate or test what was coming out of the service design phase. So in Kenya, we were using digital cookstove monitors to look at actual cookstove use of the same 30 households we were interviewing and engaging with, to sort of compare what they were actually doing with these new stoves, and compare it to kind of what they were talking about and telling us. In the the Uganda case, we took what came out, the insights that came out of the service design work in terms of key features that people really wanted to see in the weather index insurance product, and then we tested them using experiments, discrete choice experiments in the community. The third case study was quite different. There was no specific intervention in focus. I'll explain a bit more about the background to that one later. But we were looking at a long-term energy transition process in a rural part of Kenya. So we were looking at what do people in rural, off-grid places in Kenya think about the whole idea of transitioning to electricity, but over a much longer time frame. And here we had a workshop with 30 community members, and we used backcasting to try to facilitate a sort of envisioning of the future, and working backwards from there, what would need to happen to achieve this future. But it was very open-ended. There was no specific intervention in place. It was more helping people to imagine a distant future. And then we did follow-up interviews with a sample of people who participated in the backcasting about 6 months later to try to understand their experience of being a part of this process and what, if anything, had changed in the community since then. So the first two case studies then, we'll talk a little bit more in depth. The first one was this cookstove study in peri-urban Nairobi. And like I said, the plan was to try to test a little bit this conceptual framework that had been developed previously. We worked here with a local cookstove company, producer that was piloting a clean burning biomass cookstove. The idea being that if people use the stove, they will breathe in less smoke, their health will improve, and because the stove is so efficient, they will save money purchasing fuels like charcoal or kerosene. And the aim was to understand the user's experience of these things, and to try and take a sort of service system approach and try to see, using our conceptual framework, could we identify specific types of users? And if so, how could the service system be improved or enhanced to meet the needs of these specific types? And we followed 30 households, like I said, over 6 months. We did interviews, focus group discussions, and prototyping workshops, as well as workshops with more like policymakers and other actors in the system. And like I said, we were monitoring actual cookstove use at the same time. And what we found was that it was possible to identify archetypes or archetypes. We managed to find 3 archetypes, and these were defined by the underlying motivations that people had for trying out this cookstove. So they had a choice to be a part of this pilot program. So, and then for each of these types, we managed to map out their journey through this first sort of 6 months, and how they were assigning value through the use of this new cook stove. And we show how archetype journeys can be mapped and how these maps can be used to, like I said, understand how and where, when value is assigned by the user, but also when it's not going so well, and to be a bit more specific about why that is, for whom, so who's affected, and what might be useful for fixing these problems in the system. We were able to show that value comes from many different sources. So people might say that they were interested in using the cook stove for one reason, but then as they started to use it, they started to realize other things. And I think that was an important finding for the company and for others working in this sector. And like I said, we combined service design and the quantitative measurement of the stove usage. And this allowed us to kind of check or triangulate what people were saying. If they were talking about having difficulties with the stove, we were able to see that their usage went down, or their usage went up or stopped altogether. And this might sound a bit strange for a service designer, maybe, to try to almost question what people were saying, or to question the service design process. But actually, I think it was really, really important and very much appreciated by people we were engaging with in the, for example, energy ministry in Kenya, who said that it's really difficult for them to do anything with only qualitative data. They needed to be able to back it up with something else. And they appreciated having gone to the effort to use multiple methods in our work. And here's a couple of pictures. On the left, we had a sort of mapping and prototyping workshop with the users of the cook stove. And then on the right, we had a workshop with these actors, policymakers, donors, funders, who were working on the topic of clean cooking in Kenya. And it's a little bit strange. I think we would have liked to have a workshop with everybody, with the users and the sector stakeholders all together, but for sort of, I guess, social hierarchy reasons, it wasn't possible to bring everybody together. So we ended up having to do these workshops separately. But the prototyping workshop, the one on the left, we were able to take the prototypes directly from that workshop into the stakeholder workshop and use that as the basis for discussion with the stakeholders. So the second case study then was in Uganda. And just to recap, because I went very quickly through the methods slide, the objective of this study was to explore how could service design be used alongside another methodology, discrete choice experiments, to inform the design of a weather index product for smallholder farmers in Uganda. So the idea being that insurance could be a really useful thing if you're hit often by sort of unexpected weather incidents. There's often flooding, there's drought, and they get a lot of pests as well, destroying their crops. So there's been a lot of work done on insurance for small-scale farmers in especially the African context, but it's been quite difficult to come up with the specific features that will be that will make the product successful. So as part of the service design phase, we again used archetypes to capture and articulate farmers' multiple vulnerabilities and risk coping abilities. There was a huge focus on risk in this project. And then we did rapid prototyping with the farmers, both in small field workshops and also in one-to-one interviews too, where we were testing out different ideas for what a insurance product could look like. And doing this over and over and sort of trying to get closer to something that might work for people. We eventually landed on a set of core features that we were able to test in these discrete choice experiments. And what did we find then? Well, again, archetypes were very useful. They were used to capture and communicate different layers of information about different types of farmers, all related to their risk response. So what they're doing to respond to risk, what they're already doing and what they might need to be doing. Prototyping, it was extremely useful. As I said, we did a lot of rapid prototyping, really nothing fancy. None of us are particularly good at drawing, but it was more throwing out ideas, finding ways to visualize those and explain them to people. Would this work? If not, why not? And to do that over and over again. This was extremely useful. It allowed us, in a very sort of instrumental sense, it allowed us to eliminate design features that were originally thought to be useful, but we realized weren't. But it also gave us opportunities for, provided opportunities for the farmers to challenge and completely reject underlying assumptions that had previously been sort of taken for granted. One good example of this is in previous research that our colleagues had been doing, they started to get this idea that it might be a really good idea for insurance payouts to come through a village level savings group. So rather than paying directly to farmers, it might support community cohesiveness for insurance payouts to go to a sort of savings and loans group that everybody was a part of. And everybody trusted, and it was a real sort of important part of the community. But when we did these prototyping workshops and we kind of tried out this idea, what would it be like if, you know, something happens and your insurance payout comes through the savings and loan? People were really dubious about that. And it turned out that there were a lot of major trust issues with this savings and loan group, that people felt like they might be cheated, but they hadn't felt comfortable to say that in previous surveys that had been done. The question maybe had been asked in a different way. So here, when we were giving them an idea or a prototype of an intervention, it was an easier for them to explain why it wouldn't work. And then again, on combining the methods, I won't say so much about the experiments. It wasn't the part that I was responsible for, but I would say that each methodology was able to identify aspects of risk management that the other was not. So, for example, the discrete choice experiment was able to show really strongly that people would like to bundle things together. They would like insurance for many different things, for the farming inputs and credits that they could get to input into their farms. And that would increase the uptake of this insurance product. But the service design phase had sort of missed that completely. It didn't come up. Maybe we didn't ask the right questions. And the service design phase, for example, we found that people who have few assets and weak social ties, so people who had maybe come to the community more recently, didn't know so many people, weren't really socially embedded, they required risk protections other than insurance. So money on its own was not going to be enough for those people to be protected in the instance of a shock or a disaster. And here are some pictures from Uganda or actually both of these are prototyping sessions, one in a workshop with a larger group, and then on the right, sort of mapping out farmers' annual cycles, what they were doing and what was happening at different times of the year for them. So now I'm going to take a breath and a sip of water. So everything so far was going in a nice academic way. We have the conceptual framework. It's been tested now a couple of times. We start to get insights about what's useful. Archetypes seem really good. Prototyping seems really useful. And there's lots of good data to back that up. But I know, and I'm sure every PhD has these moments of like, what am I doing? What value is this bringing? Am I on the right track? And I think after the Uganda study, there was definitely a period of introspection for me. And if I'm really honest, concern, maybe worry about the direction of travel of this work. So was it becoming very instrumental? Were we just using service design to pinpoint things, opportunities in the system? I got really hooked on whether any of these methods, are they transformative? Do they have the potential to be transformative? What are they doing about agency of people? Can they really enhance the agency of the participants? And most importantly, I think, like, how are all these interesting insights we're getting from different people, do they connect to anything deeper in the system? Or are they just little design tweaks here and there that will maybe make something more attractive or more useful? And I think this is where really capabilities came in. If you read my thesis, it's all very linear, and capabilities comes in as a theoretical framing in an early chapter. But really, the honest or the real truth of it is that capabilities came much later. So what is the capabilities approach? What are capabilities? And this is really the second leg of the theoretical framing alongside service design as a practice. So like I said earlier, I really subscribe to, and I think most people do today, subscribe to the multidimensional understanding of development. So this goes beyond a utilitarian or income-based measure of welfare. And the capabilities approach it's basically a framework for well-being and justice. And it was first introduced by the economist Amartya Sen, and then it was developed further by the philosopher Martha Nussbaum into a theory of social justice. And the basic idea with the capabilities approach is that well-being is not only based on utility or consumption measured by income, but it's really an individual's freedom to lead the life that they consider valuable. That's really at the core of the approach. And it's become an alternative theory of development. It's very well established now, where the focus has shifted from the means to the ends. So away from income and wealth as a measure of progress and well-being to a focus on what a good life actually means for people. And the core characteristic of the capability approach is, what are people able to do and be? So these beings and doings come up all the time in the work of Sen. And what people are able to do and be in a wide range of areas is really important for quality of life, and it's central to the study of capabilities. And the picture of the bicycle here, I think, is really nice for explaining what really Sen meant by capabilities. And he used the example of a bicycle quite a lot in his work, that you can give a bicycle to someone and it, on paper, it's a means of transport. It's super useful. If you didn't have it before, your life should be enhanced by that. But whether a bicycle is going to be useful and valuable for someone depends on many different things. Is the person able to cycle? Is able to use the bike? Is the person disabled? Is the person a gender that it would be difficult for them to cycle? If you're a girl, maybe it's not okay for you to be cycling around in your village. Are you living in a place that has no roads whatsoever and no kind of infrastructure for cycling? There could be structural reasons preventing it, and so on. So I think that's kind of a useful way of thinking about it. And of course, capabilities you could think of as being very individual, but actually there's been a lot of work done on collective capabilities. So these are new capabilities that are generated when individuals come together and participate in collective action. So then, after all this introspection, this spell of soul searching, I went back to the findings from the first two studies in Kenya and Uganda and tried to apply a capabilities lens to them. So basically reanalyzed the findings and synthesized across the two studies to see what did we learn here about deeper capabilities, about how a service design process can support a capabilities framing. And And then using this, I guess, ex post analytical frame, tried to show how these devices support meaningful local participation in the design process. And apologies for a very text-heavy slide here. But this conceptual paper, really, looking back, or it's drawing on empirical work, but reanalyzing it with a different lens, we show that the design devices experience mapping and archetype construction and prototyping, they were used usefully to identify these individual beings and doings in relation to a proposed development intervention. So in other words, these devices, they can help identify which sets of capabilities should be in focus. For example, in Uganda, the importance of social embeddedness and power to mitigate against risks in Uganda came out as really, really strong, whereas previously the focus had been more on finance as a way to reduce risk, or enhancing incomes, or using finance as a sort of social, safety net. We also found that these devices they helped to facilitate local participation. So on the one hand, prototyping allowed participants, like I said, to critique and reject core assumptions of the interventions. But also the archetypes and the archetype journeys in particular allowed us to package and communicate experiences, very granular experiences and individual experiences, but to package those together and present to meso-level stakeholders or policymakers or people somewhere else in the system who are in a position to do something about them. So very kind of, I suppose, inspired and excited by this idea of capabilities, framing the third case study then explores whether, and if so, how can participatory design support more grassroots transformational change by facilitating community engagement around a development question. And in this case, the question was energy access and a transition to electricity in an area that had been previously very much off-grid. And here I was really keen to get into collective capabilities. So what happens when a community sort of comes together around these questions and has the space to think about and reflect on them together. So the background to this study is that we were invited by a Dutch NGO that's been working a lot on energy access to do this study. They had done a lot of work on how can electricity be used in low-income areas and off-grid areas for cooking. And they had done a lot of financial, economic feasibility studies to show that with the right efficient stoves, if people were connected to the grid, they would actually be able to afford to cook with electricity. What they didn't know so much about was what people thought about these things. How do people imagine this would look like if you had been living in an off-grid rural part of Kenya and then all of a sudden you're connected to the grid? How do people think about that? What are the local imaginaries of such a large transition to electricity? So they gave us really free rein. They wanted a very participatory process, and they wanted us to find ways to get people to think about the future. So a very sort of imaginative, speculative aspect. So we went for backcasting, participatory backcasting as an approach to do this. And we looked at a 10-year transition roadmap to electrical cooking. So we were trying to get people to think 10 years from now, if this community has electricity and you're able to cook with electricity, what does that look like? And the methodology was applied during a 2-day workshop in Machakos County, which is an off-grid area, a couple of hours from Nairobi. the first part of the workshop focused really heavily on trying to facilitate this future imagining. So really getting people to break with the present and think, okay, imagine I have electricity in my home. What does it look like? So we had people drawing pictures of what their kitchen looked like. We had sessions where people were talking about what the community looked like, what people were doing. So a focus on really the granular of what this future looked like. And we spent almost a day doing only that, telling stories and people explaining and talking about that. And now I'm jumping a little bit because of time. I hope that was clear what we did in the first part of the. Actually, I'll go back one slide just to explain. I only really gave you half the story. So the imagination part was one. So we got people to think about the future and imagine what the future would look like. The second really important part was the backcasting, obviously. So working backwards from this imagined future, we had people in groups talk about what would happen between now and 2030. So now it was 2020 to 2030. And people worked basically in portions of time. So they worked first, okay, what will happen between 2027 and 2030 for these changes to happen in the community, for my vision to kind of come true. And then the next step was, I think, 2024 to 2027. What will happen then? And so on, all the way back to the present day. So at the end of this, we had a sort of map of what people thought this transition pathway would look like, but very detailed in terms of, you know, who would be doing what would the community be doing, and what would other actors in the system be doing. And we found that this is just a selection of the findings, not everything. It was super interesting, but we found that this envisioning resulted in really wide-ranging development plans. So people went very far away from electricity to everything you can imagine to do with development. So we talked about employment, we talked about the role of women, gender, education, health. So it was really sort of a very integrated kind of development plan connected to what electricity would mean in this community. We had this energy transition roadmap, which was a super interesting output, and I think useful for the community as well. And I can talk about that later. But I think really importantly, this process of envisioning and talking together about the future led to a moment of realization, I think, within the groups about what people were entitled to and weren't perhaps currently accessing. So through these discussions, for example, it came out that there is actually a local government program that was supposed to be providing last mile energy access subsidies for the community, but nobody had really heard about that before. So there were some very kind of tangible things that came out of it. And then, like I said, we did follow-up interviews with 10 of the people who participated in the workshop 6 months later to try to hear how they experienced it and whether anything really had happened in the community since then. And these interviews were super interesting. All of the interviewees mentioned some sort of change, either at the individual or the community level. Some of them had started saving in a local savings plan for future connections to electricity, or for upgrading their kitchen in some way, inspired by things that they had heard during the workshop. 6 of the people we spoke to told us that they had a group had been formed in the area to kind of put together a petition that they wanted to bring to the local county member of parliament from Machakos County, with a list of people who were kind of demanding this subsidy to connect them to the grid. And I think a lot of people talked about, very interestingly, the need for like civic engagement in these things, so that they had really started to come together a little bit in the community and talk about what, if this change is going to happen in 10 years, that we really need to start acting more collectively now. So that was the third case study. So yeah, now is the question, what does all of this mean? What did it mean for the sort of synthesizing across these three studies? What did it mean for the PhD? So I go back to the research questions as a way to try and structure this, I suppose. And the first research question, if you recall, had to do with what are the salient features? What are the important features of service design for capturing and making sense of local contextual information for other important actors in the system? And I think the main takeaways here was that, service design provides these tools for zooming out, for capturing really important contextual factors that are often missed. And I think I've given some examples of that in this presentation. The idea of value in experience, whether a development intervention will work, sort of hinges on its value and its use. And we demonstrated ways to map and measure this for different archetypes over time. Archetypes were shown to be super useful devices for identifying these patterns in complex layered information. So people are multifaceted. There are many different things going on, but that doesn't mean we cannot find ways to capture it in a meaningful way. And then visualize this for relevant actors in the system. Yeah, I'll stop there. The next research question then was on what are the distinguishing features of service design that enable local agency in intervention design? And as I said, this question of agency, I feel like it got more and more important for me throughout the course of the PhD. But in both the Kenya cookstove and Uganda studies, we found that this rapid prototyping really helped to invite critique of the proposed design features, which in the case of Uganda, it allowed people to completely reject things that had been taken for granted previously. In the backcasting study, there are some early signs. I don't want to say too much about it because it was quite a small study, but early signs that it seems to have led to some kind of collective action. There were some little early emergent signs of that that could be connected to collective capabilities if those things were to be taken forward. And then the third research question, I'm really sorry that the format keeps changing on my slides. It's very clear that I'm not a designer. They're not beautiful, but I did my best. So the third question then, to what extent could service design methods and approaches complement or be complementary to conventional development research methods? And I hope this came through as well, that I think I'd argue that we've shown how combining qualitative service design methods with quantitative methods can lead to interventions that are both well-grounded and sort of robust, but very much connected to the granular insights we get from people. And that the insights then, we've managed to triangulate them to some degree, at least for the Uganda and the Kenya cookstove study, and present these results in a way that's more familiar and accessible for policymakers. I won't spend too long on this. Conceptual contributions. So I think really it sounds very basic, but I think I helped to demonstrate with the thesis that service design can function as a framework for integrating kind of transdisciplinary design work in complex development settings. So the first paper showed how service design could provide this kind of interdisciplinary bridge connecting behavioral science and social-ecological systems theory. And then I think the capabilities approach as an analytical lens for understanding how design devices work, and how they can be used to connect the granular with the sort of very far away important elements of the system. It seems to be a contribution and something that I'm really interested in taking further in future work. And I think this idea of being able to connect the granular to the systems level is super important when we're talking about things like SDGs and more normative goals that we have, not just in the global south, all over the world now, that we're all trying to work towards in ways to, as a way of sort of measuring how we're doing and whether the things we're doing are actually valuable for the people who are supposed to be in focus. I'm just checking the time because I wanted to leave some time for questions, but just to mention a couple of impacts, maybe you're wondering, did anything come out of any of these studies? And I think, well, talking about impact is always tricky. Impact is often the result of really many different things that play out over time. But the findings from the Uganda study were used later on to prototype an actual insurance product. And then that was kind of tested further by a couple of insurance companies. And then in the end, they decided to start selling this. And I think the last I heard was that 300,000 smallholder farmers have signed up for that insurance product. So maybe that's some kind of impact. But I haven't followed closely what the insurance product ended up looking like to be able to see if we could see any of our kind of insights coming through there. But still, it's kind of interesting. And then, like I mentioned, the backcasting in Kenya, at a very micro level, we started to see that people were doing things. People were using the information they had shared with each other. They were starting to come together a little bit. But again, I didn't have the funding or the time to go back and follow up and see what happened next. It would have been really interesting to do so. And I think this is my final slide. I really wanted to lift up a little bit or highlight that I think some of these things are relevant for other settings, for this part of the world as well. First of all, the capabilities approach, it's super universal. I mean, it was developed by hundreds of researchers working in economics and other fields, all from all over the world, from hundreds of different countries. It's which I think is really rare in terms of frameworks, policy frameworks. I think at Martha Nussbaum, so one of the key people who developed it, makes a really good point that, you know, all nations are developing nations, that nowhere is perfect, and we're all kind of failing in the same ways to at the aim of ensuring, you know, dignity and opportunity for everyone. So these things really are relevant, I think, everywhere, and that we all have room for improvement. But more concretely, aspects of the work have been applied already to look at sustainability transitions in food purchasing behavior here in Sweden. Some other colleagues at SEI have used our framework to look at recycling in Bangkok, at sustainable mobility in Bogota, and reducing work-related air travel here in Sweden. We just landed 2 new FORMAS research projects looking at food waste here in Sweden, and we're going to use the same framework, working together with the public sector in Region Göteborg and Västra Götalandsregion. So we'll be co-designing interventions based on this sort of theory of behavior change and service design and capabilities with public sector actors there. And we're also working with the government of Scotland to try to help them identify kind of like levers across government that could help to support the kind of societal transformations that they feel are needed to tackle the climate and nature emergencies. But they really want help connecting that back to communities, and questions around just transitions and so on, linked to welfare. So we're going to try to use aspects of the framework to, especially the capabilities lens, to inform that. So yeah, that's what I have for today. I hope it was graspable. It was quite a lot. I was planning to be selective, and then I realized I have an opportunity to talk about all of it, so I should take that. So thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Great presentation. And I think we have 10 minutes left for some kind of questions or reflections from the audience. So please raise your hand if you have something you would like to ask Fiona or reflect about the speech. Maybe you can put down your presentation. I can open up so we can see each other, and I will. So there you have. Well, we see. Please, someone. I can start with some kind of question, because I think this was really interesting presentation, and I was thinking, how would you describe that this? What was the difference by using these methods in some kind of design methods that you was talking about, in a bit? But I think that, was it the contextual thing that you were in some kind of in the African context? How did you use language? I mean, were you working with translators when you were doing these workshops, and how did that work out? Because I think the facilitating of the workshop is often the most important thing sometimes. But how was that possible to do with some kind of translation?
Yeah, really great question. I think it varied a little bit from case to case, and as we learned going along as well, what works well and less well. So we did workshops where initially there was sort of live translation as we were talking. And we realized that's not the best way to do it. But so we shifted over to having a local facilitator do everything in the local language. But there's trade-offs, right? So we had to spend quite a lot of time kind of making sure that person really understood everything that we were after. You lose a bit of control as well of, asking follow-up questions, and also ensuring that everybody is allowed to participate. So we're trusting that this facilitator is a neutral actor, and that they are making sure that all the voices are heard. And then when they're translating back to us, that they're translating all of the opinions and insights. But that was a trade-off we decided was worth it, to make everyone feel comfortable and make sure that people understood what was happening and could really freely express themselves and not feel held back by language. So that was the workshops. In the interviews, it was often direct translation, because then we really needed to get kind of be able to ask follow-up questions and get exactly what people were saying.
Oh yeah, perfect. Thank you. Did you use trained designers with that were talking the language while doing the facilitating, or what kind of people were doing that?
No, they were often in the workshops. They were often local people who were kind of known in the community. That's what we were hoping for, at least people that were familiar, but not necessarily designers at all. And then we worked together with a group of students actually who followed us for a couple of the projects, and they were not designers, but they became, I'm not a designer, but they became as kind of familiar with the methods as we were. So it really felt that in the end, we didn't really have to explain anything. They knew what we were doing. They were like sketching and just freestyling. So that was really lovely. And it was a real shame that we didn't have more time and more budget, I guess, to be able to have the same team in all of the places. Yeah.
Thank you. Jonas, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you for presentation, Fiona. It was interesting, and I thought when you mentioned this prototyping phase that you were in when you got to that, and you said you weren't that used to kind of you did some sketches and you did something. Should you have in the back mirror now? Would you have used more of prototyping, more of lo-fi products or something like that to kind of even get more information from the participants, or have you thought about this prototyping phase?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say, because I think we were sometimes like scarcity is the mother of creativity or something. So because we didn't have amazing sketching skills or the materials to quickly make really nice prototypes when we were out in the bush in Uganda, we made do with what we had. A lot of it was in interviews with people, more in like verbally talking, storytelling, basically, as a way of prototyping. Looking back on it, it might have helped to have, a better prototyping toolbox, and to be a bit more skilled with being able to quickly make these facsimiles, or what you want to say, to show people. But at the same time, it was a bit of a humbling thing as well, that, okay, we're not great at drawing. They would help us draw. We drew stick men sometimes, and people thought that was hilarious. They're like laughing at us that nobody really looks like that. It was a bit of an icebreaker as well. And it gave us other things too. And I think we had just about enough skill or tools to be able to, meet people and explain and share an idea. I think that's the important thing, for everybody to be able to have a shared canvas and something to talk about and critique together. And I think that in Uganda especially, it was mostly storytelling that was the most effective prototyping tool.
Yeah. Thank you.
I see Karin is here. Can I just say, Karin was with us for a different study that we did, and really it showed it just speaking to your point, Jonas, that having a designer with us to be able to do these live sketches as we were interviewing, and it gave a dimension that we just weren't able to bring to it ourselves. So I think just want to acknowledge that.